Hi, Ned. Hi,
Cord.
Kathy. Hi, Alan. Rick.
Oh,
Hi.
hi, Rick. Nice to see you, Rick.
Okay,
Anybody,
I'm
anybody
going
else on?
to basically mute everybody for this time. I'm sorry, but okay, hang on a second. Manage participants, and we're going to mute all. Okay, everybody is muted by default, but you can unmute yourself. Okay, Alan, thank you so much for being here tonight to talk with us. This is a great opportunity as part of the climate series that the Kellogg-Hubbard Library has been hosting through the winter, and together with a number of groups, including 350 Vermont, and sponsored in part by the Hunger Mountain Co-op and Extinction Rebellion in Central Vermont. So a lot of people have been very interested in doing this. Originally, we were going to be live with real people hanging out together at the North Branch Nature Center. Unfortunately, things have changed, but we are here today. So I'm going to keep admitting people as we go along here. So this presentation is the next to last. Next month in May, have Beth Sawin on Wednesday for change instead of Tuesday, May 13th, also at 6:30, also online at Zoom. And if you go to the Kellogg-Hubbard Library Facebook page, you can pick up a link there to register for that event. The other thing I just want to mention is that there's a lot of complex material that we'll be thinking about, learning about tonight. And as we have questions that come up, please feel free to add questions into the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, I'll try to go back through those and summarize those back to Alan so that Dr. Alan Betts can refer to those and respond to those. And then also tomorrow, we're going to have a midday brown bag lunch from wherever you are, and it's a Zoom event. So if you're interested in talking more, I would love to have a chance to do that with you and figure out what we're going to do with this knowledge and what is the condition of the world. And one of my hopes in part is to find a way to encourage more study groups, perhaps, anywhere, everywhere, you know, in towns, but maybe even virtually now, that could do round-robin journal groups around climate, the science, the policy, that's right, and the actions that we're all wrestling with as we bear down on this crisis. So we're going to go ahead with the presentation, and then again, as I said, circle back at the end to kind of look at the chats and take questions. And Alan, thank you. Let me just also mention a little bit about Alan Betts' background. He's a research, leading climate researcher in Vermont. He was publishing stuff, when I was in just coming out of high school. Excuse me. He's been working on land-air relationships, the sort of thing you've seen when you look at these dramatic churning convection cells coming across the Amazon, or across the Canadian prairie, or across the central Vermont. And these are very complex energetic systems, and it's part of the research that he's brought to work on the global climate modeling questions. And a long list of publications and awards for his work on behalf of thinking globally about climate changes underway. So really kind of privileged to have Alan Betts with us tonight to talk with us. And again, questions to chat box, and thank you all for being here. Alan, thank you.
Thank you, Ned. Well, forget all my qualifications and this and that. Think of me as a resource. This particular talk is already on my website here. That's just my name, alanbetts.com, under talks. You'll find a PDF of all my slides. The issues that we are dealing with are very complicated. And I'm going to, if I can get myself, I'm going to talk partly about the scientific aspects on a global scale and a local scale, because for about 15 years ago, I realized it was my responsibility to help Vermont deal with climate change. But given the fact I've been doing this for 15 years, and you know what's been happening to the political system, more and more I've been trying to map out for audiences what the fundamental difficulties in us dealing with it are, what the obstacles and what the changes of attitude and thinking patterns and in society and in capitalism, our financial system, and our entire frames of reference, how they are driving what is happening and why it's been so difficult to fix. And specifically, I'm going to also try and frame the concept of resistance. So I'm going to cover a lot of things. Just follow along. You can go back for reference later. You can discuss a lot of these things in groups, and you can always come back for me for more guidance, and I'll probably just send you more stuff, columns I write for the newspapers and things like that, that go over specific topics in more detail. We face a catastrophe, and we've kind of known it was coming for about 40 years. In fact, when I moved to Vermont in the late 70s and started gardening here, classic Vermont climate, but the National Academy had already written its first report on climate change. And the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, the oil companies in particular, had already been told by their own scientists what was going to happen a few decades hence. And they did everything they could to suppress that information. The question is, can we stabilize the climate? Well, the answer is yes, but it's not easy given our history. And our responsibilities are really for the future. They're for our children and to the earth itself. And the central question, the way I'm going to frame this, is are we just going to sacrifice our kids and the earth just so we can maintain business as usual, as our society envisages it? Or will we actually make what is a tremendously difficult effort to transform society, guided by moral values rather than profit, and guided by a reconnection with the earth itself? But I start off with something kind of pretty, because this was an absolutely exceptional winter. These are 3 of my grandchildren digging over my rye crop. Notice it's January. This is smart resilience because I'm training them early. The girl in the middle here, actually, she was digging 4 years earlier, and this was old hat to her, and I'll come back to her picture sometime. They're having fun doing it. And this was an absolutely exceptional winter because for the very first time, I know my garden soil was unfrozen all winter, except for occasional mornings after the temperature dropped down to -5 and it froze at the surface. That's under a cover crop that you see that's digging over, and a little snow cover and a couple of inches of mulch. Probably the first time since Vermont was settled 15,000 years ago, probably the first time since the last interglacial 100,000 years ago. I continued digging in February. This is back to my cold frames there where I've got things wintered over. And by the 1st of March, there was almost nothing left to dig. The concept of resilience is very important because our society as it runs has no concept of resilience. Everything is based on quarterly profits. For this, you have to understand the technical and ecological issues, but you also have to place value on the future, great value on the future, because resilience, long-term issues are something our society does its absolute best to ignore. We have to re-engineer our society for efficiency as well as resilience. And that also means rejecting what you'll hear over and over again. This is not cost effective. This is not cost effective. What that means is this is not cost effective for today's bottom line. But the background here is if we spend $1 trillion on climate resilience now, we save 60 trillion later this century that our grandchildren and children will not have to pay. It will bankrupt them. But if we ignore it, the costs are catastrophic, not just for humanity, but for all the Earth's ecosystems. So resilience is also a community concept. What does it take to shift our communities from an individual perspective, which we're encouraged to be. And right now we're in this kind of individual isolation. So some things have been quite sharpened, and also the need for community to counter it. And what will it take for resistance? Well, imagination, creativity, because you need to be inspired and not depressed by what I'm saying. So I'm going to start by contrasting some mindsets to understand what it is, the mindset of our society, and there's several different ways I shall frame it. This one is technology will save us. And parallel to that, we human beings are in charge. We don't have to change our behavior. We can engineer it. I flag this because one thing we are unaware of is that this concept that humanity is in charge of the planet goes all the way back to the Greeks. It's a dualistic concept that came long, long ago into our society. We've clung to it, even though it's untrue. The idea of our economic system is that economics based on individual consumerism produces what we call wealth. It makes some people very rich. Oil specifically has made us very rich because it's given us tremendous power. And then there's a kind of background dream that we don't have to worry about the future. Inventions will power it for us. But if you contrast to this list in purple here, climate, life, and humanity are interwoven. Environmental intelligence is crucial. Community imagination and creativity is essential. Our time frame is not this quarter, it's intergenerational. And sustainability, which is closely related to resilience, and justice are closely interwoven. Now, I used the concept of environmental intelligence, and we're going to define that as the blend of natural science, social science, and indigenous knowledge that helps humans interact constructively and creatively with the living natural world. Now, this is something that's totally missing as we simply exploit the environment to support corporate profits. We dump the costs on the poor, the indigenous, our children, and all of life. And this shift to thinking in terms of what's an environmentally intelligent way to approach our problems is a huge conscious challenge for our society. It's a key to smart community resilience, and buried in there, spiritual roots are also a key to it. And I will come back to that at the end or in discussion. The second mindset way of looking at a society is to contrast the Western capitalist mindset, which we're all embedded in. It's anthropocentric, it's egocentric, it's dualistic. Again, this dualism going back as far as the Greeks. Its concept is we simply exploit and subdue the natural world. And one critical thing which we rarely ever discuss, its growth was based on cheap fossil fuel. In the specifically post-World War II period, the US controlled the global supply, simply froze the price at $3 a barrel, and that lasted till 1973, when first OPEC rebelled and then Iran a few years later. We were furious at that because the entire growth of our post-World War II consumer society was based on cheap oil, driven by it, powered by it, but that kicked the whole of the climate change issue downstream and started all growing. And it's essentially driving climate change and ecosystem loss at this point. If I contrast that with the indigenous mindset, it's ecocentric, it respects life and nature, it shares resources, it's holistic as opposed to dualistic. Long-term views are automatic. You've probably heard of the 7-generation philosophy, but it's definitely not part of our Western education. But these are in sharp contrast. This one specifically for its holism and long-term view. The economic doctrine versus reality is something we really have to grasp, and we really have to embed it so deeply in us that we can simply look at people like Greta does and say, what you're doing makes no sense. The free market, everyone wants this free market in our society if they have money. It's designed to promote material growth and make some rich. But what the freedom means for the capitalist system here and the economics is the freedom to exploit the earth's resources and the poor. And in that context, regulation interferes with both growth and profits. If you regulate because for clean air or for this and that, and we're seeing all those roll back at the moment under the cover of COVID. And the hidden doctrine also is that the assets and the interests of the wealthy must be protected because they fund politicians. We have a system which is entirely bought at this point by the rich and powerful. And choices must be cost effective now so we can maximize profit now. And that means dumping all our waste streams. Future costs can simply be discounted or paid for later by somebody else. But this economics is simply driving climate change relentlessly because the Earth does not discount the future. It's simply accumulating the huge energy imbalance from the greenhouse gases, and I'll talk a bit more of that in a moment, in the oceans. They're huge. 90% of that energy that cannot be radiated to space is being stored in the oceans. And the energy imbalance of the Earth is absolutely colossal now. It's 30 times the energy in the actual fossil fuel that we're burning to produce the greenhouse gases to drive this energy imbalance. And it's a catastrophe ahead. So scan through the fundamentals. You know most of them, but I'll scan through them so you understand which parts of it you don't know very well. The burning the fossil fuels transforming the climate. There are powerful water cycle feedbacks that amplify the CO2. They triple it through water vapor and they double it again where ice is involved. We're heading for a high CO2 hothouse climate. Climate extremes are increasing because the circulations are changing as the poles warm faster than the equator, and the weather costs from severe weather are spiraling. This is a number for a couple of years ago. And the memory of the burnt fossil fuels, the memory of the CO2 itself in the atmosphere, the removal time into the oceans is on the century timescale. So we have very long memory for what we're doing, meaning that the imbalance of the Earth as it heats up is decadal to centennial. We've avoided responsibility for decades. It's much easier for the system to push it downstream because it's not like a catastrophe that's just occurred with COVID virus. It's a gradual process where every decade you see large climate changes, and it's taken me several decades to reach the point where my garden simply does not freeze in winter, and I can, of course, from the gardening point of view, I can overwinter a lot of things. Everybody has been pushing it away, but fundamentally, climate change is incompatible with business as usual because that doesn't value the future and climate change stores the energy. It's linked to unmanaged technology and economics. It's soluble if we simply change the guidelines of the society away from profit to an efficient society based on renewable energy. But this is essentially a value-based moral issue that has to be, you have to confront the power and financial people. It's beyond science, economics, and the financial system, and essential to this issue of valuing the future of life on Earth. Here's a pretty picture of the Earth. It's from the 4th of January, 2012. And I show this picture because that's the 4th of January. And I'm again digging over my cover crop on the same date as this picture of the Earth up here under some cloud. The greenhouse gases are important to the Earth. This thin, tiny blue layer that I hope you can see, they keep the Earth warm. Otherwise, the oceans would freeze. But as CO2 increases beyond what it has been since, they say, the last ice age, it went up and down a lot in the ice ages, down mostly, the CO2 is warming the Earth further. The evaporation of more water vapor from these oceans triples the effect of CO2, tremendously important. There's so much more water. And then ice and snow melt, and that means less reflection of sun. That, again, doubles the warming in the Arctic, and it doubles the warming of our winters when we're in the regions that have snow. The oceans are storing the heat and getting warmer, and extreme weather is increasing for a second reason. As the Arctic up here warms twice as fast as the equator, the westerly circulations that we have been familiar with for 100 years are slowing down. Some of you watched the radar for the storm that went over the last couple of days. It was a slowly moving little whirl. It moved out to the east and then it moved back again. And it rained for where I am for close to 2 days as a result from that. Slow moving means more rain in one place. I'm going to show a few slides of the hurricane season to get to understand that why they are intensifying is because the oceans are storing 93% of the heat that can't be radiated to space because of the greenhouse gases. So all the basins in the tropics are getting warmer, and unless the shear is strong, means stronger hurricanes. And all of these hurricanes were remarkable in some way or other. And I will only discuss them briefly because I was severely touched by some. Harvey, I will start with. That was a real shock, and it illustrates the problem our society is already facing. Only a couple of 2 or 3 years ago, Harvey came up to the coast as a Category 4. This is Texas, there's Houston, and that's San Antonio. It came up as a Category 4 storm from a very warm ocean. And then instead of just going inland and weakening, which has happened to every hurricane that's hit Texas before, it stayed in one place, wobbled around here for 4 days, 4 days. And the result was traumatic. Warm ocean, strong storm, very heavy rain rate, and 2 stationary high pressure systems. These stationary weather patterns to the north and east and west trapped it over that region, a region the size of Massachusetts with Houston in the middle. 40 inches of rain and a disaster. But I'm showing it also because the Weather Service and the Forecast Service had never seen anything like it. They didn't believe their forecasts. They basically said, this is a classic forecast a day after landfall. This event is unprecedented. All impacts are unknown and beyond anything experienced. Follow orders from officials to ensure safety. Now, that's not a good forecaster for a weather service. They basically didn't dare believe the forecast. The people on the ground didn't know what they were dealing with, except it was raining very heavily. And there was disasters there because they built housing zones in the floodplains of upstream dams. They had no idea they were floodplains. No one ever dreamed that those dams would all have to open all their floodgates if they got 40 inches of rain. It had never happened. So people were flooded who didn't even know they were in a floodplain. It was an utter disaster, and they're still recovering. Irma came along a little bit later, and I put this up because 2 of those grandchildren you saw in the first picture are at this point, as Irma goes by as a very strong Category 5 storm, they're huddled up in a small hotel on the south of St. Thomas is this side, and Puerto Rico is over here, with hurricane shutters clinging to each other. And hearing people screaming in the halls. Well, you don't want to have to deal with a Category 5 storm. It simply blows through buildings and dumps everything. Well, they were evacuated from that to Puerto Rico, but unfortunately, a couple of weeks later, Maria came up, only Category 4, a strong one. It wiped out all the cell towers and power grid for the entire Puerto Rico as it went across. And I put this up because there's some narratives on my website. You want to have some grasp of what happens when you lose everything, as opposed to, say, when COVID closes everything. This is a bit of an insight into that. They lost the grid. They survived because they drove to the southwest of the island where they thought they had connections. But here's a strange storm. This is last July. It's a very, very weak hurricane called Barry, and it started as a thunderstorm near Kansas City. Have you ever heard of a hurricane starting near Kansas City? No, we haven't had one before. It went down very slowly in a weak circle backwards, again, stationary weather patterns. Over the warm ocean became a weak hurricane, only Category 1. It only did $1 billion worth of damage, and then went up again back towards where it started. Never had one of these. Get used to the strange. And then Dorian came by, and this was an utter catastrophe for the Bahamas, because this is a picture of it when it was over the Abacos, and it was a perfect Category 5 plus storm, I think 185 miles per hour, almost stationary. It crept westward. It sat very slowly, went over the Grand Bahama here with a 20-foot storm surge on an island that's mostly only 15 feet, wiped that island. It went up the coast. Unfortunately, it missed most of the United States. A disaster, the strongest storm at this latitude that we've ever seen. It's not just us that's suffering. There's a couple in Mozambique last year. They used to be very rare off southeastern Africa. This couple killed a lot of people. This one dumped 60 inches of rain. In the northeast, we're getting increased precipitation. And just to give you an example of this, you're all familiar with Irene, the spring flood. There were two big floods on that year, 2011. A spring flood when heavy rain and warm weather melted a large snowpack, and that was in the northern parts of the state on Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain actually came up to flood stage of 103 feet and stayed there, I think, for 2 months. Severe floods on these rivers. And it was wet all summer, and then Irene came along and dumped not a lot of rain, but produced extreme flooding because it had been wet all summer. But I'm showing this to give you a sense of this issue of stationary patterns. And this is 9 years ago now. This is the rainfall ranked by state for 6-month period in 2011 that covered both those storms in Vermont. But these ones here for Texas and New Mexico mean that those two states had the driest 6 months in the entire record, which is 117 years for rainfall. But Ohio to Vermont had 117 here, had the record wet 6 months on record. And you can see, looking at this, that most of the storms went across the north. They all avoided Texas and New Mexico, even though the governor was holding stadium fulls of people praying for rain. This is the drought of record in Texas and the flood of record that we do our planning for up in Vermont, but it went all the way down to Ohio. You've seen these pictures of disasters. There's a person there. This is the Cavendish Road. This is I walk down to this covered bridge every morning, but I've measured the height there. It was 10 foot 3 inches on that, it's a railway sign. There's a railway track behind me. But that floodplain on the Otter Creek basically saved Middlebury. The amount of water stored here was such that the water over the dam in Middlebury was half the water over the dam in West Rutland. It showed us a concept of resilience for communities. 13 towns cut off overnight. The state emergency systems in Montpelier flooded. FEMA had no road access, but communities simply reorganized overnight and stepped in to try and fix it. In Brandon, just north of me, they said, we can do this. We can build a gravel road in 72 hours, but we have to check the bridge before we pave it. This Wardsboro quote, we worked 120 hours last week and there's still a lot more to be done. This is early September, and 120 hours means 17 hours a day, 2 hours before sunrise and 2 hours before sunset, pretty much, well, an hour and a half. Staggering what those people did there. The networks connected supplies, basically people managed it. They put things over the mountains, even on horseback if necessary. But we had communications. We weren't like Puerto Rico, which lost its entire communication grid. If people sometimes had to climb a mountain to get a cell phone service. Flooding is increasing for 2 reasons. Warmer temperatures means higher rain rate, and it's 4% increase for every degree Fahrenheit. And as the Arctic's warming twice as fast as the equator, the north-south temperature gradient's going down, the westerly jet stream is slowing and meandering, patterns are staying stationed for longer. And slower moving storms mean more rain in one place, and so more flooding. An example was Harvey, 4 days over Houston, and Florence stayed 3 days over North Carolina. What we used to do to manage water was to get it off into the streams and rivers as fast as we could. We just managed it, as we said. This means we now must oversize all culverts and bridges. The other issue, though, is that as extremes of flooding increase, also extremes of drought are likely to increase. And we really need to store water in the ground for summer use. Because what happens in summer, the water extraction by roots from the ground damps the variation in precipitation and rainfall, about 60%. And that maintains evaporation in dry years and keeps the forests and crops going. I showed you this one before, but you see, I don't think I need to go into it again, no. The community resilience issue is We have to share our infrastructure, our resources, our knowledge and awareness. We do that in disasters. We do need to start doing it as we plan for what lies ahead. We need to redesign everything to maximize our efficiency and use of power. Then we can substitute renewable energy. We need to localize and share our food system. We have that, but you notice in this particular disaster, the farmers' markets were not a high priority with the state system, with the state government. We need a shared, efficient transport system. This is a big, big issue, and I'll touch on it once later, but you have to give some thought to that. We need to support the ecosystems long time, and that needs imagination and determination. And I flag it to a quote here from Joanna Macy, who said that the aim of society is to create happy, isolated individuals addicted to consumerism, escapism, and the media. None of that, nothing in here fits this particular description. But this is how, one way in which society has tried to keep us under control, not objecting to the way capitalism is simply sucking money into the hands of the rich. Another fundamental distinction that we do not make, but is interrelated here, is that the distinction between the human-made world, I'm only put that in because we used to call it the man-made world. We understand the man-made world because the world, think of the world of computers and technology and all our stuff. Because we made it, it's predictable and controllable unless we're really stupid, which we are sometimes. But the natural world, which is far more complex, alive and interconnected, is not true that it's predictable and controllable. We struggle to understand it. There's huge amounts we don't understand, and prediction and control are uncertain. For those of you who know the background of this, E.F. Schumacher called the natural world the created world. And the capitalist world does not value the natural world. It's simply a resource to be exploited, a place you can dump your wastes. Now, I've been gardening in Vermont for 40 years. So a few little numbers here. When I started gardening in the late 70s, the growing season was about 125 days, about a month longer. The ground was frozen for about 155 days. It's now about a month less. We used to have a hard freeze in November, and the climate zones, for those who know, were zones 4 to 5 in Vermont, and now it's 5 to 6. That's a 10 degrees Fahrenheit warming in average winter temperatures. But the winter variability is increasing a lot. My wake-up call was January 2007 and 8, when I found I could dig over my cover crop in January. Warmest on record December, and there was some snow cover that year. 2012 was a real extreme, where the ground was not frozen in the beginning of January, and it was totally thawed in March. 13, these pictures. This is the first time my granddaughter was able to dig in February. And I said, for the very first time, 2016, it was an El Nino year. And I said to her cheerfully, you know, as a grandfather would, you must be the first kid to dig over the ground in Vermont since the last interglacial 100,000 years ago. And she just looked at me, as my grandfather losing his mind. But now she thinks, oh, I can dig over the ground in winter. My things I winter over in glass, this is spinach. I've been eating spinach since the beginning of this month, and I have absolutely full of lettuce. This is lettuce. So these are just the reminders of what I was talking about, those two pictures. But this is the issue of variability. The Eye in the Sky community checks Styles Pond for the date of freeze up every year back since 1970. And it varies a lot from year to year. This is days of the year, so this is the end of the year. And the line that's put on there is 3 days later, 4 days later, every decade for freeze up. And this is melt in spring, and that's a 3-day drop in the date, decrease in the day of melt every decade. You put those two together, and this is the time that Styles Pond has been frozen since 1970. And the line on that is 7 days decrease every decade. But look at the variability. This is 2016, that's 15. The variability now is as large as the trend in 40 years. So we have an issue here. one of the things associated with variability is that the vortex at the pole, as it has got weaker, as the pole has warmed, is becoming more unstable. And you've heard about the polar vortex bringing cold air down into northern North America. What that means in practical terms, it's us, in fact, in North America that's getting most of the big variations and extremes. This was February last year, very cold across the western United States, very warm in Alaska and into Canada, warm across Eurasia. These dark colors here are very warm, and these blue colors are cold. Whereas this year, 2020 was the warmest January ever for the entire globe on average, and it was very warm here, but it was cold up in Alaska relatively, and very warm across Eurasia. These temperature change differences here are 5 or 6 centigrade in a monthly average. Think of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The permafrost is melting. It's also been extreme in terms of rainfall. This is the year July 2018 to 19. And these are ranked precipitations for the year. These 124s mean that these entire basins here in the Mississippi River had the most precipitation ever on record, as did all these in the eastern United States. The Mississippi flooding was the longest on record. I'm going to say a few words about snow cover. Let me have a glance at the time here. Yes, I have a little time left. Snowfall, we thought we understood snowfall, but I started to do some analysis in the last 4, 5, 6 years with an enormous, incredible data set from the Canadian prairies. It's hourly data with no missing data for 50 years, 15 stations. And these, what you see on the left here is the arrival of the first big snowstorms in the fall. The mean date is November the 15th. And I've put all the data on the prairies for 50 years. So there's about 200 or 300 years of data in here, and just put them together to show you the fall of temperature across the day of the arrival of the first big snowfall. No snow, snowfall. And it's about a 10 degrees centigrade or 18 degree Fahrenheit drop. And you don't get it back on the prairies if the snow doesn't melt until spring. The average date of melt over this 50 years is March the 26th. When the temperature goes up, it goes above freezing in the spring, and you lose that snowpack, and it's 0 on day 0. Snow cover actually acts as a climate switch, and we didn't really grasp that. It's because the snow reflects sunlight. That also reduces evaporation on the water vapor greenhouse. And if you map something as simple as the fraction of the days with snow cover, this is Alberta, for the period when there is any chance of snow, October to April, you get almost a straight line. There's, again, a few hundred years of data in here. And the temperature drops a low fraction of snow from freezing to something that, again, is about -10. In fact, for those of you who have ever taken a class on climatology, the climate in winter falls into just 2 groups. This is the climate for days without snow cover and the climate for days with snow cover. And they're separated by 10 centigrade, 18 Fahrenheit. What we were traditionally taught is the climate in winter is the average of those 2, which is this black line. And that doesn't mean anything, because if it's days without snow cover, you're on this red line, and days with the blue line if there is snow cover. And that is across the prairies. There's a couple of stations there. The difference between snow and snow is this fundamental 10 centigrade, 18 Fahrenheit. Well, that's on the prairies, where the snow is very reflective, 70%. For Vermont, we have forests. Reflection of snow is only about 35%, and the temperature falls about 6 centigrade, 10 Fahrenheit with snow cover. Well, I'm going to start to shift direction now. This is a picture of the Arctic sea ice in the year which still is the lowest cover. The ice cover floating on the Arctic used to be inside this purple line in September, when it's a minimum. That's the end of the melt season of summer. And this was the lowest. About half of it melted in September 2012. And the things that are going on there are the same feedbacks. Ice reflects sunlight, and keeps it cold. Water absorbs the sunlight and the ocean gets warm. Water, the ocean evaporates. Ice doesn't evaporate. So you get more evaporation, gives you more water vapor greenhouse. Those are the same basic feedbacks as our winter. Now I put that up because someone did an interesting plot. Looks complicated, but this is they were trying to explain our responsibility for melting the ice cover of the Arctic. This is the total emissions of CO2 all the way back 150 years, 170 years now. It's in units of thousands of tons of CO2. So this is all the emissions, and this is the cover of ice. And they put a graph and a running mean on that. You can see the decline of the ice cover, and you can see it will go down to zero when we reach a certain number of emissions. But they did it because the fit there has a certain slope, and that slope enables you to do a simple computation, which is this. I have a car, it gets 25 miles per gallon. How much of that melt of the Arctic sea ice is my driving my car responsible for? Well, it's 15 square meters for 12,000 miles in a year, which is 150 square feet. Think of that as about 4 sheets of plywood. So every year you drive your car, you move down this slope here enough to melt about 150 square feet of the Arctic ice, just from you driving an inefficient car for 1 year. So let's bring up my pictures of cars here. When I went from a gasoline car to a hybrid car, it was just a Prius about 10 years ago. No, 10 years ago roughly. I gained about 50%. I got 50 miles per gallon. When I moved only 2 or 3 years ago from a hybrid to a plug-in hybrid, a Prius Prime, this car, I now get 135 miles per gallon. I was absolutely staggered. The car itself only goes about 30 miles in summer, all electric, but it's the most efficient car running on either electricity or gasoline in the world. But I'm still one person driving around a 3,000-pound car, 60 miles per hour. This is a cute little thing, which is an electric-powered tricycle with a solar panel on the top. Doesn't use hardly any electricity. You get some kind of protection. They're made in the Carolinas. Yeah, they're not cheap. They're a few $1,000s. This is a cargo bike, about $1,000. These only go about 20 miles an hour, and their payloads are much smaller than my car. But I want you to start thinking about the big transportation issue. Driving this and getting my power from a community array, I've dropped my transportation requirement, even with just one person in the car, by 80%, which is basically the reduction in greenhouse gases we need to make in order to solve the transportation side of our problem. In fact, all our fossil fuel problem. If we were to give our kids one of these, instead of letting them drive old trucks, they'd get exercise, they'd be able to get around at essentially no cost, no insurance. They'd have to slow down and wear helmets, of course. The transportation issue is very big, and we have to think about it inventively, and we also have to think about the basic issue of how we share transportation. Carpooling is one thing, but why can't we use Google-type apps so that I can walk to the end of the road and just my neighbors will pick me up, whoever's going north? We have the capability technically to do that, but that means community sharing. Well, we promised in 1992, that's almost 30 years ago, that we would stop dangerous climate change. We can do it. We stabilize CO2. It means that 80% drop in our emissions of CO2. Possible, but difficult. It's difficult because the fossil fuels have driven our industrial growth and our population growth indirectly 200 years. Our lifestyle, what we're so proud of, has become dependent on that, and there are powerful vested interests because there are trillions of dollars at stake. There's no moral guidance, certainly no smart moral guidance. You all know about the transition year of 2015, and 188 nations made commitments. Virtually none of them have actually followed through with them. That's why Greta came out on strike in Sweden. The encyclical by Pope Francis on the environment and our responsibilities to the earth and climate change was a significant marker there. He specifically said the exploitation of the earth and the poor are inseparable, We've done our best to ignore that in the United States. He said that short-term profit as a primary motive is immoral. We've done our absolute best to ignore that. He basically told the Catholic Church to act. But what has happened in the 5 years, that the institutional resistance has been huge. As you know, the US has canceled its commitment, and we're heading now from millions of species. All the reports, I quote one here, we'll lose 1 million species this decade or two, and habitat loss, climate change. This is the actual increase of total emissions on a global scale of carbon. The CO2 is missing on my slide. Don't know why. Creeping along, 1% increase per year for the decade of the 90s. Huge increase in the 2000s when we moved our capacity, industrial manufacturing to China. We did it burning coal, polluted their cities. They shifted on a massive scale to renewables, and the rest of the world a bit to natural gas. And it flattened right out. It's creeping up again. This was the drop for the 2008 crisis. We will probably see another drop for the COVID crisis. But our society will do absolutely everything it can to get us back onto a consumer growth economy as fast as it can, powered by fossil fuel. How much we can burn? Well, we have only 750 gigatons of fossil fuel left to give us a 50-50 chance of keeping the warming below 2 degrees. That means leaving 2/3 of the fossil fuels remaining in the ground. 20 years left at the current rate of burning it. Rapid phase down will extend that period, but that means also doubling or tripling our energy efficiency. We are very, very inefficient because we had cheap fossil fuel. Creative approaches, efficient society, vision, deep change, work with the biosphere, and most of these things you can read. The big obstacles are that the financial system, which we have little control over at the moment, is amoral at best, immoral if you look a little deeper. The fossil fuel reserves are worth a staggering amount of money. Of course we're going to burn them. The banking system is funding new fossil fuel development and sweet talking on their website, stuff you can imagine about how they're creating a healthier society. The asset managers are investing in fossil fuel companies and utility, with, again, sweet talking websites. And the insurance industry invests enormous sums in the fossil fuel industry because you can't build new things without insurance. And all these financial interests essentially being boycotted and pushed to either charge double for all fossil fuel or stop funding them altogether. But most of our investments, this issue is still not in our colleges and things. I don't know what the status of the divestment at UVM is, for example, at this point. Comment on capitalism and COVID. Capitalism exploits people and resources to maximize profit and minimize costs, with no consideration for resilience or long-term stability, no consideration for justice for working people or for life on Earth. It exposed essentially the servitude of the poor with limited assets and healthcare. It led to the collapse of a vulnerable global economy because everything had been outsourced and the links all broke. And we can see exploitation within our healthcare system in the United States that's unique to us. Looking ahead, well, you know most of this stuff. The challenges, complex living systems nearing collapse, fossil capitalism, incompatible with a livable Earth, financial, political, social resistance, corruption everywhere. But the moral issues are surfacing at last because of this central issue, sacrificing our children and the extinction of the species in a stable biosphere. So the global rebellion has started. You're probably familiar very much with Greta. In fact, you'll be familiar with all these slides, so I'll just flip through them. Notice she grew up in a year, 15 outside in the Swedish parliament. She recovered from the trauma of having to think about it and decided she had to do something about it. Millions of people on school strikes. This is Montreal last September. But the Extinction Rebellion has so far been, I know there's a group supporting this particular meeting, and Vermont is ahead here, but as a whole, it's been kept out of the United States, but not out of Europe. The issue is a very simple one. This is a civil rights issue. It can only be checked by civil disobedience to defend the rights of our children, the rights of the earth. And their first big move, after spending whole winter educating the people of England was to go to London with 100,000 people and simply shut it down until the government's declared a climate emergency. Very well organized. There have been actions around the world, and at the moment, you should get their weekly newsletters and you should look at the depth of their discussion and argument and thinking at rebellion.earth if you haven't done so already. But I want to shift to something that I wasn't aware of. This is a beautiful quotation from Frederick Douglass, 1857, just a few years before the US Civil War. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will quietly submit to, and you've found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong that will be imposed upon them, and these will continue until they are resisted. This is as good a description of the way our society is kept under control now as it was back then. And he was specifically talking about something that, again, I did not know of. He was talking about the rebellion of 60,000 slaves that was called by the Jamaican Black Baptist minister, Samuel Sharp, on Christmas Day, 1831. He called out 60,000 slaves, nonviolent rebellion. They simply asked for half pay. They wanted half pay, which was probably a pittance. They were crushed. He was tried and executed for treason, just asking for half pay. But the strength of that moral stand led to the Slavery Abolition Act, and it abolished slavery for the entire British Empire in the 1830s. And the context back of that is that Britain had forbidden the global slave trade with the British ships, but they had not freed the slaves because they were essential to commerce. And the parallel now is that all the people that are oppressed in our system, that are trapped within it, they're essential for commerce. And we're having this very vague discussion of what their real rights should be. The climate emergency is here. This is the last decade to avoid the worst. Citizens and communities must demand action. The governments are going to be paralyzed still by corporate dollars, and the US is particularly helpless. On a global scale, you see some glimpses. The Netherlands Supreme Court, after several years of actions, finally ordered the Netherlands government to meet the commitments they made in Paris in 2015, and for this year and for 2025. And they had to shut down some coal-fired power plants because the new Netherlands Supreme Court has the power to order the government to do this. And legal actions are coming elsewhere around the world. Here we are in Vermont. Obviously, we can't fix global challenge alone. Well, we have certainly strength in Montpelier, and I don't know how they're going to come out of the COVID crisis. But everywhere you hear politicians talk about doing something while growing the economy. And of course, there are often threats from veto from the governor. But redoing capitalism is critical and a huge challenge. And just growing the economy, as we've done it with a throwaway economy, making people consume stuff they don't really need to keep things going. We need to develop a better model. We need to build things that will last, and we need to move away from a growth economy. We cannot grow exponentially and have the planet survive. The financial system is another huge issue. We could drive change in the energy and transport systems, but we need deeper thought. Relocalize as much as we can. Businesses, medicines, food supplies. I mean, the decentralization of that scattering across the world has made a lot of it collapse at the moment. It's made it impossible in the US for us to get enough testing because all the reagents have been decentralized to places we can't access anymore. We'll probably have enough water, but there's going to be big changes across the US with southern and western droughts, fires, and floods, and that will impact migration. So this is my discussion slide. This talk is on my website. My email is there if you want to contact me and ask questions. Power concedes nothing without a demand. I think we have to start making demands, looking people in the face and saying what the consequences are of what we are doing, and saying, is this acceptable? Are you going to sacrifice our children and the earth? Be as clear and understanding of the details that we can simply calmly say that to people. just as Greta has done to most of the world's leaders. I'm going to pause there. I'll check how much yep, I talked about 45, 50 minutes. We've got another half an hour at least. And I'm going to kick this back to you, Ned, to deal with the questions. And I think you're going to try and do it from people's chat.
Yeah, so thank you, Alan. That was very wonderful integration of all the things that we're wrestling with. And people that have any questions that they want to share with Alan, and please put those into the chat box and we can kind of pick through those and discuss those together. Lots of really rich stuff in there. And the CO2 shifts are one of the things that are really important. I guess, Alan, maybe I want to ask one of my questions before to come in as well. But, you know, one of the things that many people have been concerned about is, you know, there's lots of strange new dynamics happening with the climate shifts. One of the things that I've been aware of also is the Arctic as a wild card. And you were talking about the Arctic sea ice diminishing in the summer. And I suspect that the adjacent land has also become, you know, increasingly exposed and warming in conjunction with that. And part of that is changing permafrost. Part of that is releasing carbon more rapidly. Part of that is methane from Arctic wetlands, and the other really unknown piece is perhaps these Arctic marine methane deposits. Do you have any thinking about that? Have you that?
All those things are happening. All of them are uncertain because we don't know. They're all instabilities in the system. They're not things to really worry about because until we start changing our direction, all the issue is when will they melt? When will the methane, frozen methane in the ocean come out? We don't know. And there are all similar sets of instabilities on the Antarctic glaciers as well, because they're being undercut by warm water in the southern Pacific. But again, rather than worry about the details, when are we going to slow the system down? There are lots of instabilities here. We don't know them until we have never seen them before, other than in paleo records. So I don't worry about those things. I'm waiting for us to figure out how we're going to slow down the capitalist growth economy and the exploitation of the earth, the people, and all our waste streams, just dumping all our waste streams for free. When are we going to make the system pay for the long-term costs? That's what will slow it down.
I guess what I wonder about, Alan, is who has the power, right? So that's the question.
The power is very important. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And we have been too, you could have a group that could spend a day or so writing down all the ways we've been kept under control so that we will submit to this system, and different levels of society are put. The scientific community was told our job is to provide advice. The political system will follow your advice. And you know what a travesty that is. It will not. The people who are now desperately impoverished, the so-called, I mean, I could go on down the justice issues, but you know most of those. Questions, folk? Okay,
here's another one that comes in, and again, this, you know, you obviously have a lot of rich background and thinking and deep concern, so you get to answer all the hard questions.
Happy to.
Clearly, we're taught that we're supposed to argue to people on the basis of self-interest and their economic self-interest.
Right.
And that seems to be failing as a system. And so one person here, Kirk, is offering, you know, while morality per se doesn't seem to generate much change, perhaps food gets our attention. And COVID-19 has underscored our vulnerability, disruptions in the food supply. So again, this is like a self-interested angle on motivation, perhaps. Should we be more focused on food as part of this moral equation as a motivation for getting climate action?
Well, localization of our food here in Vermont is an easy task. We could push it. The system, I mean, I'm following what's happening in New York. And the farmers in the north of New York are dumping their milk because the system that is in place to process it is collapsed. Cabot is sending, I think, trucks to take that milk down to New York City. Cheers for Cabot. But the system as it is collapsing in many places because of the way it is done simply to maximize profit rather than with resilience and sustainability in mind. And that is why the mental framework here is critical. We can localize our food supply. We've done some steps towards that in Vermont. We haven't really pushed it very far. And as a whole, our food supply has been commercialized. It has been scattered across the world for wherever anything can be grown cheapest. And most of those links at the moment are collapsing. You know, right now, Brazil is collapsing where some of our stuff comes from because they have a ruler, a president or whatever, who refuses to recognize this particular virus. And so everybody's going down with it on a massive scale. Most of our medicines need to be localized. It's something that have been taking for 30 years simply became unavailable at the beginning of April. But fortunately, because we shifted it to India, and India subsourced it to Asia, and all those supply links broke down. Fortunately, Canada, however, makes its own medicines, controls the prices, and I can get what I need cheaper from Canada. The distinction is, the problem is so much worse in the United States. This is on the theme, the shifting things to where it is cheapest just isn't going to work in the future. There are too many places where these chains are going to break down. A single solar flare will wipe out our communication system. And believe me, that's going to be another big disaster for global capitalism. But the present system, which just maximizes profit, minimizes costs, exploits people everywhere, pays no attention to the future, and auto-resilience is just not going to work. We should simply say, we have to rebuild it. And that means, in the first instance, to shift the economics of it, we have to put all the costs on it. Right now, we could put a fossil carbon tax on fuel. Nobody in the public would notice because the price of oil collapsed because of another feud around the world and the reduced demand for oil during this economic crisis. Nobody would notice if we put 10, 20 cents on a gallon of gas. It's gone down $1 or so. Oh, it's still way high because they're making extra money. But what's actually happening is the oil company want hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies to keep their profits up to what they're used to. And nobody's really protested. There are some protests on that, but so far they haven't managed to get it. But all the corporations, the system view is we should prop them up because we want to go back to the system the way it was. Right.
Well, these are all really, really important. And the who is the we and how do we shift? And
how do we shift from individual to community?
Right.
And buried in there is, are we going to reconnect with the earth like an indigenous people would do? And I can't ask a question of you. I wrote an article in January that basically said, go out into the natural world after you've take a deep breath and try and connect as if you were an indigenous person. And I went down in my 650 words through that whole process and reflected on how we lost that ability within our Western society. And I went through the Christian example that Christianity had to dump the indigenous teaching of Jesus, Yeshua in Aramaic, an indigenous language, simply to become the imperial religion of the Roman Empire. They had to do that because the emperor insisted on Greek dualism. The Greek Gospels throw away the Aramaic ones. They're holistic. They don't have a sense of power. And right back in that day, 1700 years ago, our society basically adopted the Greek dualistic concept to separate science and religion, science and the state, separate everything out into boxes where things could be controlled. So we're all brought up on that system. And we actually have to take a deep breath, reconnect to the real outside world, and understand that we are not in control of the natural world. And in a much deeper sense that we don't want to recognize at all, the earth can strike back, not in an anthropocentric sense, but in terms of its fully coupled living ecosystem. It can strike back. It's not, we don't understand it in the way an indigenous people or an indigenous medicine man would, who is actually able to step into that world. But we need some more people that do understand that, because once you have that, it's such a power for you, all of you who are listening, as an individual, to grapple with our society that doesn't care anything about the future of the natural world, that we're utterly dependent on.
I'd like to pick up on that in a couple other levels here. So there's a lot of great questions coming in now. And this really relates to what you were saying, but I'm going to pick up on it in a different way. But even today, I saw the Yanomamo, in the New York Times. You may have seen that this very isolated but large group in the Amazon has been affected by COVID-19, brought in by gold miners and oil extractors in the Western Amazon. Tremendous amount of deforestation, and as you know, how that affects, forest, sky, convective cells, and agriculture. A country with a leader that is aggressively going the wrong way. And so Deb is asking in part here, can this COVID crisis help with this transition? And the powerful are fighting to maintain their wealth and power for themselves. So what happens in this time could change the power structures if enough people are willing to fight for it. And I think Vermont has some things going for it. We have a co-op and credit union, a lot of mutual aid things happening, and a lot of worker-owned enterprises and local agricultural institutions, a lot of parallel institutions that are more benign. We also have a statewide index, I'm forgetting the name of it immediately for some reason, but the genuine progress indicator, trying to integrate some of these values of the natural world into our sophisticated.
Pick some questions to me, Ken, or we'll run out of time.
Okay, all right. So basically, I guess I was thinking that maybe there's something in there that we could use to shift the power from the system moving along. Sue Morris asks, other than driving electric vehicles, do you have specific suggestions for individuals to reduce their level of impact?
Well, there are all the usual things. You can sit down with your family and your community, and you can ask what you can do. Where you live, can you retrofit it to high standards? Can you push in your community for net zero housing and rules on what we can actually build? Because we don't have them in Vermont. We are still free to build shabby 2x4 stick houses because this is freedom, individual freedom. But it means the destruction of the earth. It's part of that energy consumption system for the future. We need to stand up and say to our local government people, no, we have to have real building rules for the future. We have to have the car issue. Well, there are three things. The energy for electricity, we are doing better on here. That is sort of looking after itself. But reducing all our energy usage, that's something you can do within your own home. The transportation, I think we have to figure out how to share transportation using some kind of car transportation networking system. We have the computer technology to do that now. But it means a shift in attitude from an individualistic to a community framework. So you have to figure out where to start there. Where to start there. Because we still have 90% of the cars driving around, 3,000-pound cars, 4,000-pound trucks driving around with one person in them. We can certainly ask from the COVID crisis, is it necessary for me to drive as much? Have I learned to be more efficient with my driving? Well, my driving has dropped enormously. I still drive a mile to the store, sometimes once or twice a week. But I happen to have a local store, which Commuters, which has almost everything I could possibly need. It's very, very fine. The related there is this, consider this shift of mentality. You are willing in our society typically to help your neighbors, but are you willing to ask your neighbors for help? Are you willing to make this a reciprocal process in which we discuss with our neighbors who can help each other, how we can help each other with what? That's a big change in our social system. And we need to go down that step, and also down the step of a deeper discussion of who can do what in terms of resisting the system. Because everybody has different parts and possibilities here. But I can't see everyone that's here, but I'm willing to bet that all of you understand what I'm talking about.
I think part of it is the shifting thing is the really magic stuff that we're all struggling with, you know, and what forms it takes. And Kathy was asking, in part, is it possible to recreate the victory garden concept? And also, how do we create community? And I'd like to know how spirituality comes into creating community and values and morals and ethics. And I'm also kind of listening, Alan, and I'm wondering in part is, here we are dependent, utterly dependent and isolated at this time with COVID-19 in a lot of ways. And interdependent nonetheless. And when we reach out and we ask for help, which is a very scary thing to do, but we ask,
why is it scary to do?
Okay. Well, I'm thinking that it's outside the cash economy. You know, it's creating a reciprocity, a dependency, and I think out of that, which is very hard for me, out of that comes a connection that's very powerful.
You have been trained not to make those connections within our society. In indigenous society, none of this guilt and conflict over, it's a mutual dependence, simply accepted. Issues of power don't arise, issues of authority. There are people who are obviously have older, wise people in those societies, but you ask them for help, they help. And we ask the others in those communities to help, and they help. And you look for where you can help, and help is not rejected. The society here has trained us to be isolated individuals because we can be controlled more easily that way. We're trained to go out and just consume, buy stuff. And I won't go down the route of the distinction between the way women have been trained to consume versus the way men have been constrained to consume, and the role games that the advertising industry has played all these decades. All that started back in the 30s, in fact, in the United States. And people don't realize that the model of the US advertising industry was picked up by Goebbels to control the German people in World War II, in fascism. But it all came from this consumer model and how you manipulate people to do what you want to make the economy grow so some people can get very rich. And we still basically have accepted most of that rule book. So these are not trivial changes, but Earth Sunday was Earth Sunday was 2 days ago. So once a year, I get asked to talk to a church on Earth Sunday. In this case, it was the United Church of Underhill, who have a justice group, and they have both this understanding of the spiritual issues as well as an understanding of justice issues. And they're willing to sit down, even now remotely, and talk with each other every week.
That it sounds like it's responding to a lot of the things that are coming up in the chat. which is how do we, you know, create these communities around shared values and extend that and create places of reciprocity, places that we can succeed at building a new set of values. And perhaps this reciprocity has to be, you know, primitive and simple, but it also has to be gestures toward the larger living world that we are a part of. And these are all, I think, perhaps critical changes of values underlying a lot of other important political and
Right.
personal actions.
In quote, it is our society that has to use the word spiritual to cover the things that are not controlled by money. But gratitude and reciprocity are very, very close. Gratitude and reciprocity, yes, thank you, Kathy. Those are the two sides. And we have to shift in our relationship to people and the natural world to those two concepts. Grateful for what we have, and we understand it's a reciprocal process. The only way we can actually deal in an integrated way with the natural world that we're busy destroying is to change our attitude into one of gratitude and realizing there's a reciprocity here. We won't like what we're getting from the climate change end. We won't like it. I mean, give you an example that I find so funny almost. Australia had terrible problems with drought and then fires and catastrophe. Now, I look at that and I say, and the Prime Minister's, I've forgotten his name, but he's a conservative and he's doing everything he can to deny that climate change had anything to do with it, let alone the exploitation of their water supply, let alone the exploitation of everything there. Okay, well, I say Australia is the #1 exporter of coal in the world. No discussion of that aspect. From the Earth's perspective, this is justice. From the Earth's perspective, you're the #1 exporter of coal, driving the climate change, driving the drought. You're exploiting the water and the land there, and you're surprised when you get devastating fires. The Earth is not anthropocentric like us. So we would turn that around and say, oh, you can't say, but the Earth is burning up Australia as revenge. No, it's not. But there is an interconnection there. You can drive the system so far, and the system will respond. And the response here is fitting for the country that's the #1 exporter of coal in the world, that's driving the circumstances.
Good. Maybe one thing to end with here, as we're wrapping up toward 8 o'clock. There's a couple of things coming in here. There's lots of stuff coming in chat. So I really want to acknowledge that Sherry Mitchell is being mentioned in her book on sacred instructions. How do we raise the visibility of these things that we care about, helping people to feel empowered and not feeling overwhelmed ourselves at the same time. Montpelier and its effort with re-energizing the capital area networks, neighborhood groups, which is basically a mutual aid format for the neighborhoods. So a lot of these things are really, in many ways, going back to an earlier point in the chat, was this crisis that we're in, coincidentally or otherwise, dismembering the planet, is teaching us a little bit about what we're missing and how overextended we are. What do you see, perhaps, by way of closing? And also, I want to make a point to people about signs of hope, Alan, signs of hope. And also, I just want to remind everybody that we will have this discussion tomorrow at noon to follow up on this conversation and take it further. I hope to have a chance to chat more with people. And Steve Crowley is pointing also to his weekly Sierra community conversation on a just transition, reaching out to other groups that might feel threatened and
Yes.
help.
Can you also
voice.
simply copy all the questions on this chat to everyone that is here, and we can collectively attempt to answer them? I can answer some of them, others can answer others of them, and just go around that just for a few days so that and some of those can be saved by some of you have organizations, you can save them, because we have to be able to share this information. This is a very difficult way of doing it. It's easy to give a talk, but it's not an easy to do it. Actually, I'm going to show you the next picture that I have here. This is, some of you saw it. It's a poor town in northern Punjab. And at the beginning of April, they woke up and were able to see the Himalayan mountains 120 miles away for the first time in 30 years. No one under 30 in this town had ever been able to see them through the air pollution. And here they were this magnificent range. Staggering psychological impact on that town. That pollution decrease around the globe is also a measure of the decrease of this carbon dioxide. This pollution comes from the burning of fossil fuels. The carbon dioxide comes from the burning of fossil fuels. This is more smoke and SO2, NO2 and NOx of one things produces the air pollution. They're all coming from the burning of the fossil fuels. We're going to get a marker for the next few months, and we will see a little dip in our reduced consumption. But psychologically, that community got to see clear skies. So does Los Angeles at the moment, get to see clear skies. But anyway, yes, that's my picture for a kind of shift in perspective. Ask what you can see now that you couldn't see before. Are you going to just let it go back the way it was before? I mean, I listened to Andrew Cuomo many days, and I can see him dancing around the issue of all the people who are desperately underpaid, who we are utterly dependent upon within the society. And the farm workers are another aspect too. I had no idea until I listened to someone's webinar a few days ago that the people that are here on these something A2 visas or 2A visas, I don't know, have absolutely no rights. They were given no rights in 1930. Farm workers have no rights. And so when they're in a situation where they're going to get COVID, if one of them protests, we simply deport them back to Mexico, where they have to pay off the debts that they incurred to buy the right for this visa here in the United States, where they are slaves. They are the extreme example, but apparently the number of these visas have gone up by a factor of 5 in the last few years. This is the way we can get slave labor to run our fields now. And it all goes back, their lack of power. Them and domestic workers were given no rights back in the 1930s because they were mostly black or immigrants. We have to look at the system and who we have exploited. They may not all be relevant here in Vermont, but we can look here in Vermont. It's absurd that we are still arguing about minimum wages. It's absurd we're not willing to pay people for their, we are now able to call them essential workers and still pay them less than the minimum wage. Right? Is that just? By no standards, but standing up for those little things in our own communities and by finding out ways to share our resources, share our stuff. Do we have to buy it, or can we actually share it? Sure, this is not good news for those people that sell all that stuff, but we need to shift those people to rebuilding the actual society to be resilient.
Alan, thank you very much. I think that's a really important thing to underscore, and I really want to redirect everybody to visit Alan Bett's website for climate documentation and articles. Here's a slide with the link at the bottom. And I do hope people will come join us in the various conversations that are happening that you're learning about in the chat with Sierra Club, and tomorrow at the library and beyond in study formats, and with the Sangha and with other groups where people are working together in creating community gardens and mutual aid and extending those farther into our communities and learning from this crisis. And Alan, also, let me just finish also by mentioning that, again, next month, Beth Sawin will be here on this same time and space, Wednesday, middle of May, and watch for that posted on the Kellogg Hubbard Library Facebook page. And a link is up there now to register for that and get a calendar item. She's a really remarkable researcher in systems thinking, did a lot of stuff around basically looking at global systems of various types, and Climate Interactive is the organization she's working with right now. Danella Meadows is a person she worked closely with when Danella was still with us. So really very insightful stuff and very involved in a lot of the international discussions about thinking systemically, acting systematically, and carrying values authentically in our lives. So I think that'll be a very rich conversation. Alan, thank you so much tonight for being here with us.
You can all send me emails, you know. I do answer my emails. I may
Excellent.
just shift you to something where I've written a longer tract on it, but that's, you can read.
Good, good. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
That's my wave goodbye.
Yeah.
We have 37